The winter of 1883 didn't just freeze the Bitterroot Mountains. It suffocated them. Alice Caldwell, a man carved from the very granite and pine of the peaks, needed a cook, someone to keep the hearth fires burning while his shattered leg healed. What he got was a shivering woman, with a belly swollen with child, standing on his snow-swept porch as the sky bruised purple. She wasn't the sturdy, leather-skinned pioneer he'd bargained for through the town sheriff. She was a ghost in a worn wool coat, carrying nothing but a battered carpet bag and a secret that would soon drag the violence of the lowlands straight to his door. He hired a maid for survival, but the mountain was about to hand him a reckoning. The advertisement pinned to the community board outside Hiram Walsh's mercantile down in Derby had been brutally simple. Wanted cook and housekeeper for High Mountain cabin. Room, board, and $10 a month. Must not fear isolation or hard work. Ask for Alice Caldwell. Alice hadn't wanted to write it. For 8 years, since the avalanche that took his younger brother, he had lived as a hermit on the unforgiving slopes of Trapper's Peak. He was a trapper, a hunter, a man who preferred the honest brutality of a grizzly over the deceit of civilized men. But a falling lodgepole pine 3 weeks prior had pinned him, splintering his right tibia. He'd managed to drag himself back to his cabin, set the bone with agonizing force, and splint it. But he was hobbled. The deep winter was coming, the kind of winter that buried cabins to the rooflines. If he couldn't hunt and he couldn't chop enough wood, he would die. He needed hands. When the buckboard wagon, driven by a cursing local boy named Toby, finally crunched up the winding, rutted trail to Alice's clearing, the first flakes of a November storm were already spitting from a lean sky. Alice stood on his porch, leaning heavily on a crutch fashioned from a sturdy hickory branch. He expected a stout widow from the valley, perhaps an older woman, with hands like ham hocks and a constitution of iron. Instead, a woman stepped down from the wagon, and Alice felt his jaw tighten. She was young, perhaps 25, with pale skin that looked nearly translucent in the harsh mountain light. Wisps of auburn hair escaped a modest faded bonnet, but it was her silhouette beneath a heavy threadbare wool coat that made Alice's chest tighten with immediate anger. She was heavily pregnant, at least 6 months along. Mr. Caldwell. Her voice was soft, melodic, but threaded with a steel wire of exhaustion. "You've got to be joking," Alice rumbled, his voice a low gravel pit of a sound. He glared past her to the driver. "Toby, what in the devil is this?" "I asked for a worker, not a charity case. She's the only one who answered the ad." "Alice," Toby shouted back, already turning the horses. "Sheriff cleared it, said you take her or you starve. Good luck to you." The boy with the Rianess and the wagon rattled away down the treacherous path, desperate to beat the coming snow. Alice turned his furious, dark eyes back to the woman. She hadn't flinched at his shouting. She stood ankle-deep in the snow, clutching a single carpet-bag, her chin raised. "I am Nancy Jenkins," she said, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "I am a capable cook, Mr. Caldwell. I am clean, I am clean, I am quiet. And I am not a charity case. I am here to work." "You're in the family way," Alice said bluntly, pointing a calloused finger at her midsection. "This ain't a place for a woman in your condition. There's no doctor for 30 mean. If the winter closes the pass, there's no getting out till spring. You'll die up here, and you'll take that child with you." Nancy's eyes, a striking shade of storm cloud gray, locked onto his. "If I had stayed in the valley, Mr. Caldwell, we would have starved before the first snowfall. I have nowhere else to go. I will earn my keep." Alice stared at her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the blue tint to her lips, but he also saw a desperate feral pride. The wind howled through the pines, a low, moaning warning. He couldn't send her back now, even if he wanted to. A woman on foot wouldn't make it down the mountain in this weather. "Get inside," he grunted, turning awkwardly on his crutch, "before you freeze on my porch and give me another body to bury." Nancy followed him into the dim interior of the cabin. It was exactly as one might expect of a solitary, injured mountain man. The air was thick with the smell of old grease, wet wool, and wood smoke. Dust coated the rough-hewn tables. Dirty cast-iron pans sat on the cold stove, and the floorboards were stained with mud and animal blood. Alice watched her take it in. He waited for the tears, the disgust, the immediate demand to be returned to civilization. Instead, Nancy set her bag down by the door. She unbuttoned her heavy coat, revealing a simple, dark cotton dress that stretched over her rounded belly. She rolled up her sleeves, exposing pale, slender wrists. "Where is the lye soap?" she asked, her voice steady. "And the bucket? I'll need to boil water." Alice blinked, thrown off balance under the wash basin. "Pump is out back." "You have a broken leg," she noted, looking at his splint. "I will fetch the water. Please sit down, Mr. Caldwell. You are in my way." Alice Caldwell, a man who had fought off a mountain lion with a hunting knife, found himself dumbly obeying the pregnant woman, hobbling over to his armchair by the cold hearth. He watched in a stunned silence as Nancy Jenkins began to systematically dismantle the chaos of his life. For the first week they lived in a tense, weary orbit around each other. Alice was a man of long silences, unaccustomed to the rustle of skirts or the soft humming that sometimes drifted from the kitchen area. He watched her constantly, waiting for her to break. The work was brutal, the cabin was drafty. The wood stove required constant feeding, and fetching water from the half-frozen pump was a grueling chore. Yet Nancy didn't break. She bent. She struggled. She sometimes paused to press a hand to the small of her back with a silent grimace, but she never complained. And slowly the cabin began to transform. The layer of grime vanished from the windows, letting in the pale winter sun. The floorboards were scrubbed until the natural grain of the pine showed through. But it wasn't just the cleanliness. It was the atmosphere. Nancy brought a strange, quiet dignity to the savage wilderness. One evening, Alice sat at the table expecting the usual hard attack and salted pork he'd been surviving on before she arrived. Instead, Nancy placed a steaming bowl in front of him. It was a rich, thick stew made from the last of his venison. But she had foraged wild onions before the snow got too deep and thickened it with a roux. Beside the bowl sat a warm, perfectly golden biscuit. Alice picked up his spoon, took a bite, and stopped. The flavor exploded in his mouth, a taste of home and comfort he hadn't experienced in nearly a decade. He looked up at her. She was sitting across from him, eating slowly, her eyes cast down. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Nancy paused, her spoon hovering. "My mother taught me. We ran a boarding house in Missouri before I came west with my husband." "Thomas," Alice said, remembering the name on the sheriff's note. "What happened to him?" A shadow passed over her face, rapid and dark. Her hand unconsciously went to the small, tarnished silver locket that always hung at her throat. "He died in a mining accident down near that cave-in." The lie was smooth, but Alice had survived in the wild by reading the subtle tells of predators and prey. The slight twitch of her jaw, the way she avoided his eyes. She was hiding something. But out here, a man's past was his own business. Alice had ghosts of his own. "Well," Alice grunted, taking another biscuit. He was a fool to leave a woman who cooks like this. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given in years. A faint, dusty pink rose in Nancy's cheeks, and for a fleeting second, the corner of her mouth twitched upward into a half-smile. It struck Alice like a physical blow. She was beautiful. Hidden beneath the exhaustion, the grief, and the swelling pregnancy, there was a striking, resilient beauty. As November bled into December, the snows deepened, locking them into the high country. Alice's leg was healing, but painfully slow. He spent his days whittling, repairing traps, and watching Nancy. He noticed the refined way she held her teacup, the precise, elegant stitches she used to mend his torn flannel shirts, the way she read from a worn pocket Bible by the firelight. She was a woman of grace, thrust into a world of grit. But the mountain was a cruel master, and it demanded its toll. One afternoon, while Nancy was outside hanging wet towels on the line strung across the porch, she slipped on a patch of black ice. Alice heard the sharp gasp and the heavy thud. He threw his crutch aside, ignored the searing pain in his leg, and lunged out the door. Nancy was on the snow, clutching her belly, her face chalk-white, eyes squeezed shut in agony. "Nancy!" Alice dropped to his knees beside her, his massive hands hovering over her, terrified to touch her. Terrified not to. "Nancy, talk to me." "Is it the baby?" she gasped, her fingers digging into his forearm with surprising strength. I just slipped. The wind knocked the breath out of me." He didn't wait. He scooped her up in his arms. She felt impossibly light despite her condition. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the biting wind, and laid her gently on his bed in the corner of the main room. "I'm fine, Alice," she protested weakly, though she didn't try to get up. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. "You're not fine. You're exhausted," he growled, pulling a heavy bearskin rug over her. "You don't move. You hear me? I'll tend the fire. I'll make the supper. Your leg. My leg is fine enough to boil water." He snapped, though the pain was making him dizzy. He looked down at her, his rugged face etched with a sudden fierce protectiveness that startled him. "You rest, Nancy, or so help me. I'll tie you to this bed." She looked up at him, her gray eyes wide. The harshness in his voice didn't match the extreme gentleness with which he tucked the fur round her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. That night Alice slept in the chair by the fire. He listened to her steady breathing, realizing with a heavy heart that the silence of his solitary life was gone forever, and to his absolute terror, he didn't want it back, but the real storm hadn't even begun. The blizzard hit 3 days before Christmas. The sky didn't just darken. It turned the color of bruised iron, and the wind began to scream through the canyons like a wounded animal. By nightfall, the snow was falling so thick and fast it created a disorienting whiteout, piling up against the cabin walls and threatening to bury the windows. Inside, the temperature plummeted despite the roaring fire, but the cold was the least of their problems. Alice's frantic dash into the snow to save Nancy had done more damage than he let on. The sudden weight-bearing had refractured the healing bone slightly, and worse, the splintered edge had torn the flesh from the inside. A fierce red infection began to streak up his calf. By the second day of the storm, Alice was burning with a terrible fever. He lay shivering violently under a pile of furs, his skin slick with sweat, his eyes glazed and unseeing. The giant of a man had been reduced to a delirious, rambling wreck. Nancy, now entering her 8th month, found herself the sole guardian of their survival. The roles were entirely reversed. The woman he had fought too fragile to survive the winter was now the only thing standing between him and death. The wood box inside was nearly empty. To get more, Nancy had to brave the porch, where the wind ripped at her clothes and the snow drifted waist-high. She wrapped herself in Alice's oversized canvas coat, tied a scarf over her face, and waded out into the howling maelstrom. Her back screamed in protest with every swing of the heavy axe as she split the pre-cut logs into manageable pieces. The cold bit through her boots, numbing her toes. She hauled the wood inside, piece by piece, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She melted snow for water. She brewed a harsh, bitter tea from willow bark Alice kept in a jar, knowing it could ease the fever. She sat by his side, bathing his burning forehead with a cool rag, ignoring the persistent, tightening aches in her own abdomen. "Elijah," Alice mumbled, tossing his head. "Elijah, don't go out there. The ridge is unstable." "Elijah." Nancy paused, the rag dripping over the wash basin. Elijah, the brother he had mentioned only once in passing. "I'm here, Alice," she soothed, keeping her voice low and steady, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You're safe in the cabin. The snow is falling, but we are warm." Suddenly his massive hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. His eyes flew open, but they weren't looking at her. They were staring at ghosts. I couldn't dig him out. The snow was like concrete. I dug until my hands bled, but I couldn't find him. A tear leaked from the corner of the hardened mountain man's eye. I left him there. Nancy felt a profound ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her physical exhaustion. She gently placed her free hand over his massive, trembling one. "You did what you could. You survived. He would want you to live, Alice." Slowly, the tension left his body. His grip loosened and his eyes fluttered shut as he slipped back into a fitful, exhausted sleep. Nancy stayed by him through the night, keeping the fire blazing against the encroaching frost, fighting her own exhaustion. It was late on the 3rd day of the storm when the fever finally broke. Alice woke up. His mouth tasted like old ash, and his leg throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but the burning delirium was gone. He turned his head. The cabin was dimly lit by the dying embers of the fire. In the rocking chair beside his bed, Nancy was slumped over, fast asleep. She looked incredibly pale. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and her hands were blistered and raw from the axe handle. She was still wearing his heavy canvas coat over her dress. Alice stared at her, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so intense it made his throat tighten. She hadn't just kept the fire going. She had dragged him back from the edge of the grave. The pregnant, delicate widow from the lands had fought the mountain on its own terms, and she had won. He slowly pushed himself up on his elbows, grimacing at the stiffness in his body. He reached out to pull a fallen blanket back over her shoulders. As he did, the canvas coat shifted. Something slipped from the deep interior pocket of the coat, a pocket Alice knew was torn and often trapped loose papers. A folded piece of thick, yellowed paper fluttered to the floorboards. Alice leaned over, picking it up. He opened it, expecting an old receipt or a trapping license. Instead, he found himself staring at a bounty poster issued by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency out of Denver. The drawing was rough, but clear enough. It depicted a man with sharp features and cold eyes. Wanted, dead or alive, Thomas Jenkins for armed robbery of the Union Pacific Express and murder of 2 guards. Reward $5,000. Warning: Jenkins is known to have hidden the stolen payroll. Associates or family may be targeted by the Dalton gang, whom Jenkins betrayed. Alice's blood ran cold. He looked from the poster to the sleeping, pregnant woman beside him. Her husband hadn't died in a mine cave-in. He was a train robber and a murderer. And worse, if the Dalton gang thought Nancy knew where the money was, the violence she had brought to his mountain was far from over. The wind outside began to die down, the storm finally breaking. But inside the cabin, Alice realized a much deadlier storm was just beginning. The silence in the cabin was suddenly heavier than the snow piled against the door. Alice stared at the yellowed Pinkerton bounty poster in his massive trembling hand. The rough-sketched face of Thomas Jenkins seemed to mock him from the paper. $5,000 armed robbery. Murder. Alice crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles turning white. The noise, though slight, was enough. In the rocking chair, Nancy gasped, pulling herself from the depths of her exhausted sleep. She blinked against the dim light of the dying fire, her eyes focusing on Alice. She saw him sitting up, saw the dark, furious storm brewing in his deep-set eyes. And then she saw the canvas coat on the floor. Her hand flew to her chest, her pale face draining of whatever color remained. "You went through my things," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep and sudden terror. "It fell out," Alice rasped. His throat was still raw from the fever, but his voice carried the dangerous, low rumble of a cornered grizzly. He tossed the crumpled ball of paper onto the foot of the bed. "A cave-in down in B, you said." "An honest miner." Nancy stared at the paper as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She didn't move to pick it up. She just pulled the blanket tighter around her swollen belly. "Alice, please, who else knows you're up here?" Alice demanded, swinging his good leg over the side of the bed. The splined leg throbbed violently, but the adrenaline masked the worst of it. "The Dalton gang, Charlie Siringo, and the Pinkertons." "Did you leave a trail right to my front door, Nancy?" "No." She stood up, swayed slightly, and caught the back of the rocking chair to steady herself. "No one knows. I swear it. I bought the wagon ticket under the name Mary Smith. I didn't use my real name until I got to Derby, and only because Sheriff Miller demanded it for the registry." "Sheriff Miller is a drunk who talks too much," Alice spat, running a heavy hand over his beard. "Well, there's a bounty on your husband's head and missing union payroll. Those men won't stop at the state line. They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth, thinking you know where the money is." "I don't know where it is," Nancy cried out, her voice breaking. Tears finally spilled over her lashes, tracing tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "Thomas was a cruel man, Alice. A vicious, cruel man. He didn't tell me his business. He would disappear for weeks, come back smelling of cheap whiskey and gunpowder, and beat me if I dared ask where he'd been." She pointed a trembling finger at the bounty poster. "I didn't know what he had done until the night he came crashing into our rented room in Missouri, bleeding from a gunshot wound in his shoulder. He was frantic, screaming that Bob Dalton had double-crossed him, that the Pinkertons were right behind." Alice watched her, his anger warring with the raw vulnerability in her eyes. He had seen liars before, men who'd swear the sky was green to save their necks. Nancy wasn't lying, she was terrified. "He packed a saddlebag," Nancy continued, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "He told me to run. Not for my safety, but because he knew if the gang caught me, they'd torture me to find him. He rode out the back window into the night. 3 days later, I saw that poster nailed to the mercantile wall in town. I sold my mother's silver, packed that carpet bag, and I ran." "And the baby?" Alice asked, his gaze dropping to her rounded waist. Nancy placed both hands protectively over her child Thomas's. "But this child will never know that monster. I came west to disappear, to give my baby a chance to breathe clean air away from the blood and the greed." She looked up, meeting Alice's hard stare without flinching. "I saved your life tonight, Alice Caldwell. I chopped your wood and broke your fever. If you want to throw me out into the snow to freeze, do it. But do not call me a liar." The wind howled outside, a lonely, desperate sound. Alice looked at her blistered hands, the dark circles under her eyes, the proud, defiant tilt of her chin. She had brought a tempest to his mountain, but she had also brought the first warmth this cabin had felt in 8 years. He slowly reached down, picked up the crumpled poster, and tossed it directly into the dying embers of the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flame. "The pass is snowed in," Alice said quietly, his voice losing its harsh edge. "Nobody is getting up Trapper's Peak until the spring thaw. Not the Pinkertons, not the Daltons, not God himself." Nancy watched the poster turn to ash, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. "When the ice breaks," Alice continued, leaning back against the rough log wall, "we'll figure out what to do. But until then, you're under my roof, and I protect what's mine." It was a possessive, primitive statement born of the mountain, but to Nancy it sounded like salvation. She sank back into the rocking chair, burying her face in her hands. And for the first time since she arrived, she wept. Not tears of fear, but a profound, overwhelming relief. The deep winter grounded on, but the dynamic within the cabin had fundamentally shifted. The wily employer and the desperate maid were gone. In their place were 2 survivors, bound by a shared secret and a mutual reliance. As Alice's leg fully healed, leaving him with a slight permanent limp that served as a reminder of the mountain's cruelty, he turned his attention to fortifying the cabin. He taught Nancy how to load and fire his heavy Sharps breech-loading rifle, refusing to accept her protests. "Out here, Grace won't stop a bullet, Nancy," he told her one morning, standing behind her on the porch, adjusting her grip on the heavy barrel. "Or you have to be willing to do the ugly thing to protect the beautiful thing." He looked pointedly at her belly as he said it. Nancy swallowed hard, a finger resting outside the trigger guard, and nodded. February bled into March. The bitter cold began to lose its razor edge, and the days grew fractionally longer. The icicles hanging from the cabin eaves began to drip, a rhythmic, hopeful sound that signaled the coming spring. But with the thaw came a new, rising terror. The snowdrifts blocking the lower pass would soon be manageable for horses, and NY's time was drawing near. It happened on a Tuesday, while Alice was out checking his close-in snare line for snowshoe hares. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue, and the air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. When Alice pushed open the heavy oak door of the cabin, dropping 2 dead hares onto the table, he stopped dead in his tracks. Nancy was on her knees by the hearth, her forehead resting against the cold stones of the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped a log. A low, primal moan escaped her lips, a sound of agony that sent a spike of pure ice straight into Alice's heart. "Nancy." He dropped his rifle and rushed to her side, his large hands hovering helplessly over her trembling shoulders. She turned her head, her face slick with sweat, her gray eyes wide with panic. "Alice, it's time. The water broke. But something is wrong. It's too early. It hurts too much." Fear, colder and sharper than any blizzard, gripped Alice. He was a man who knew how to gut a buck, how to set a broken bone, how to survive a week in a snow cave. He knew nothing of bringing life into the world. He remembered his brother Elijah buried beneath the suffocating snow, his life slipping away while Alice dug in vain. He could not lose someone else. Not her. "All right," Alice said, forcing a calm into his voice that he did not feel. "All right, I've got you. Let's get you to the bed." He lifted her easily, carrying her to the corner and laying her back against the pillows. He stoked the fire until the cabin felt like a furnace, put 3 kettles of water on to boil, and found the cleanest linens they had. For the next 10 hours, the cabin became a battlefield. Nancy fought a war of attrition, her body racked with violent, unrelenting spasms. The baby was turned, making the labor agonizingly slow and dangerous. Alice remained by her side, wiping her brow, holding her hand until his own bones ushed from her grip, murmuring low, steady words of encouragement he didn't know he possessed. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he told her, as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the floorboards. "You fought the winter. You fought the fever. You could do this, Nancy. Bring him here." With a final shattering cry that echoed against the heavy timbers of the roof, the battle broke. Alice's hands, normally accustomed to the rough handle of an axe or the cold steel of a trap, caught the tiny, slippery, screaming life that slipped into the world. He quickly cleared the infant's mouth, his massive fingers moving with surprising delicacy, and tied off the cord. The sound of the baby's furious, healthy wail filled the cabin, drowning out the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. It was a boy. Alice wrapped the child in a warmed flannel shirt and carefully placed him on NY's chest. She was exhausted, pale as a ghost, her hair plastered to her skull. But as she looked down at the tiny, red, screaming face, a smile of pure, transcendent joy broke across her features. Alice stood beside the bed, looking at the two of them. His chest heaved. He felt a profound tectonic shift in his soul. He had lived in isolation to protect himself from loss. But looking at Nancy and the child, he realized he had only been half alive. "What will you name him?" Alice asked, his voice thick with emotion. Nancy looked up at him, her gray eyes soft and luminous in the firelight. She gently stroked the baby's dark tuft of hair. "Elijah," she said softly. "His name is Elijah." Alice closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek into his beard. He nodded, unable to speak. For 3 days, peace reigned on Trapper's Peak. The sun shone warmly, melting the snow into rushing rivulets. Nancy rested, regaining her strength, while Alice doted on them both, handling baby Elijah with a terrified reverence. They were a family forged, not by blood, but by fire and ice. But the mountain always demands its toll. On the 4th morning, Alice stepped out onto the porch to chop firewood. The air was crisp. The snowpack in the valley below had significantly receded, exposing patches of brown earth and gray rock. Out of habit, Alice picked up his brass spyglass ass from the windowsill and scanned the distant tree marking the lower pass. His blood froze in his veins. There, about 5 mid-down, cutting through a stand of lodgepole pines where the snow had melted enough to allow passage, were 3 riders. Even from this distance, Alice could tell they weren't local trappers or Derby townsfolk. They rode heavy, dark horses, burdened with saddlebags and long guns slung over their shoulders. They rode with the grim, steady purpose of men hunting a trail. The spring thaw had brought life to the mountain, but it had also brought the wolves. Alice lowered the brass spyglass, the cold metal biting into his palm. 3 riders. He didn't need to see their faces to know what they were. Men who rode the high country before the mud, fully dried, were either desperate or hunting something that paid well enough to risk their necks. Given the ashes of the Pinkerton poster in his hearth, Alice knew exactly which it was. He turned and moved back into the cabin, his slight limp heavily pronounced in his haste. He barred the heavy oak door behind him, dropping the thick iron latch into place with a resounding clang that woke the baby. Elijah let out a thin, mewing cry from the crib Alice had fashioned from a hollowed-out log. Nancy, sitting up in bed and nursing a cup of willow bark tea, went rigid at the sound of the locking door. The color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the remaining snowdrifts outside. "Alice," she asked, her voice trembling. "What is it?" "Riders," Alice said grimly. He didn't sugarcoat it. Out here, a lie was a luxury that got people killed. 3 of them coming up the lower switchback. They've got heavy saddlebags and long guns. They aren't locals, Nancy. Nancy set the tin cup down so hard tea sloshed over her hand, but she didn't seem to feel it. Her hand flew instinctively to the tarnished silver locket at her throat. "The spring thaw," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "They found the trail. Thomas's men, or the law. It doesn't matter who they are," Alice rumbled, moving with swift, practiced efficiency. He pulled his heavy Winchester repeater from the pegs above the fireplace and began shoving brass cartridges into the loading gate. Clack, clack, clack. The mechanical sound was deafening in the tight space. "They aren't taking you from this mountain." He walked over to the bed, grabbed the heavy canvas coat she had worn during the blizzard, and draped it over her shoulders. Then he handed her his heavy Colt single-action revolver. "Alice, I can't." You can and you will, he interrupted, his dark eyes locking onto hers, fierce and unyielding. You remember what I taught you. Thumb the hammer back. Keep both eyes open. Aim for the center of mass. Do not hesitate. He moved to the center of the room and threw back the woven rug, revealing the trapdoor to the root cellar. He pulled it open, a wave of cold, earthy air rising from the darkness. Take Elijah. Get down there. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. If the door opens and it ain't me, you shoot. Nancy gathered the squalling infant into her arms, wrapping him tightly in a wool blanket. She looked at Alice, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Alice, they will kill you. There are 3 of them. I've been killing things on this mountain for a decade, Nancy, he said softly, reaching out to brush a stray lock of auburn hair from her sweaty forehead. This is my territory. They're just trespassing. He helped her lower herself into the cramped, freezing cellar, handing the baby down to her. As he closed the trap door and pulled the rug back over it, the heavy thud of hooves squelching in the mud echoed from the clearing outside. Alice grabbed his Winchester and stepped silently to the window, peering through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. The 3 men reined in their exhausted as the herd horses in the center of the yard. They looked ragged, their dusters caked in freezing mud. The man in the center was tall, wearing a bowler hat that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness, and a finely tailored, albeit filthy, wool suit beneath his coat. The 2 men flanking him were rougher, hired guns with cold, dead eyes and hands resting comfortably near their holstered irons. "Hello, the cabin," the man in the bowler hat shouted, his voice a sharp, nasal bark that cut through the crisp mountain air. "Alice Caldwell, come on out. We have business." Alice took a deep breath, letting the icy calm of the predator wash over him. He unlatched the door, leaving the Winchester leaning against the frame, and stepped out onto the porch. He kept his hands empty but visible, resting on his hips near his hunting knife. "You're a long way from a paved road," Alice called out, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "State your business and ride on." "The pass is unstable." The man in the bowler urged his horse a few steps closer. "I am Agent Josiah G. Pinkerton, National Detective Agency. These men are deputies deputized by the governor of Montana. We are looking for a woman Caldwell, hair-heavy with child. Goes by the name Nancy Jenkins or Mary Smith. I live alone," Alice lied smoothly, his face a mask of granite. "Have for 8 years. You're wasting your time." Josiah Galt smiled, a thin, ugly stretching of lips over yellowed teeth. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "Now see, I'd be inclined to believe you, Caldwell, the hermit mountain man living off squirrel meat. But you see, we didn't just stumble up this mountain." G leaned forward in his saddle. "We caught Thomas Jenkins 3 weeks ago in a saloon in Helena. He put up a fight, took a bullet to the gut. It took him 2 days to die in the jailhouse." Beneath the floorboards inside, Alice knew Nancy was listening. Her husband was dead before he expired, continued, his voice dripping with malice. He was feeling mighty repentant. He told us he didn't have the stolen Union Pacific payroll. He said his sweet, innocent wife stole the ledger containing the bank draft numbers and the location of the physical gold. Said she wore the microfilm folded up inside a cheap silver locket around her neck. Alice felt a cold spike of realization. The locket, the one she constantly touched when she was nervous. She hadn't known what was in it, but Thomas had used her as a blind mule carrying his insurance policy right out the back door. He also mentioned, Goal said, gesturing to the freshly chopped wood and the clothesline, that she boarded a wagon heading for the Bitterroots, and the sheriff in Derby mentioned a very pregnant woman coming up this exact trail to cook for a man with a broken leg. G's eyes narrowed. "Now, unless you birth that child yourself, Caldwell, I suggest you bring her out here. The Pinkertons don't take kindly to harboring fugitives." "She knows nothing about any money," Alice said, shifting his weight slightly, preparing to move. "I don't care what she knows," G snapped, dropping the polite facade. "I want that locket. Bring her out or my men will burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside. And I'll sift through her ashes for the silver." The 2 hired guns drew their revolvers, the metallic clicks echoing off the canyon walls. "You've got 10 seconds, Caldwell," Coldette sneered. "You should have brought more men," Alice whispered. Alice moved with a sudden explosive speed that defied his massive frame and his newly healed leg. He didn't just step off the porch. He launched himself sideways, rolling violently into the thawing, freezing mud of the front yard just as a deafening volley of gunfire erupted. Lead chewed through the heavy oak posts where he'd been standing a fraction of a second before. Splinters the size of hunting knives flew into the air, raining down on the slushy ground. Alice scrambled on his hands and knees, the icy mud soaking instantly through his canvas trousers, and threw himself behind the massive cord of firewood he and Nancy had spent the grueling winter stacking. Heavy rounds thumped sickeningly into the stacked logs. Each impact sent a shower of rough bark and wet sawdust over his head. Alice was pinned. His heavy Winchester repeater, the only weapon that could hold off 3 men, was still leaning uselessly against the doorframe on the porch, 30 feet of open, muddy ground away. All he had on his person was his 8-in bone-handled hunting knife. It was a blade meant for skinning elk, not fighting Pinkertons. Spread out, Josiah Gould's greedy, panicked voice pierced the ringing in Alice's ears. Flank the woodpile. He's unarmed. Alice pressed his back against the damp wood, his chest heaving, his breath pluming in the crisp spring air. He closed his eyes for a single second, letting the icy calm of the predator wash over him. He was outgunned, but this was his mountain. He knew every inch of this clearing, every shadow, every slick patch of melting ice. He heard the heavy sucking sound of hooves in the mud to his left. The deputy he had pegged as a hired gun from the valley was trying to circle around the water pump. Alice didn't wait to be cornered. He surged upward from a crouch, his muscles coiling like a struck spring. He pulled the hunting knife from its leather sheath and in one fluid, brutal motion hurled it across the 10 yards of open space. The heavy steel blade spun end over end, a flash of silver in the morning sun, before burying itself to the hilt in the deputy's right shoulder. The man let out a gargling shriek, dropping his Colt revolver into the mud. His horse, panicked by the sudden scream and the smell of fresh blood, bucked wildly, tossing the wounded man backward into a deep, freezing puddle of snow melt. Kill him. Kill the mountain rat. G shrieked, his horse rearing as he struggled frantically to pull a Winchester from his saddle scabbard. But the second deputy, a massive, barrel-chested man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, had already dismounted. He was charging around the right side of the woodpile. A heavy Walker Colt, raised and thumbed back. Alice had no weapons left. He dropped to his knees, grabbing the heaviest piece of unsplit lodgepole pine he could find, a thick sappy log that weighed nearly 40 ob. As the scarred deputy rounded the corner, finger tightening on the trigger, Alice lunged upward from the mud. He swung the log like a crude battering ram, driving the flat end directly into the man's chest with the force of a falling boulder. The air rushed from the deputy's lungs in a violent whoosh. The heavy Walker Colt discharged wildly into the sky as the man collapsed backward, his ribs cracking audibly under the sheer primitive force of the blow. Alice was on him in an instant, driving a heavy mud-caked fist into the man's jaw, snapping his head to the side and knocking him out cold in the slush. Before Alice could rise, the sharp, searing agony ripped through his left side. Crack! Alice gasped, staggering sideways and falling heavily against the woodpile. He instinctively clutched his ribs. His fingers came away slick warm and coated in dark crimson blood. It was a grazing shot, tearing through his heavy wool shirt and carving a shallow trench across his ribs, but the pain burned like a branding iron. Josiah G. stood 20 yards away, a smoking revolver in his trembling hand. He had finally managed to dismount and steady his horse. He cocked the hammer back again, a sickening, triumphant grin spreading across his face, exposing his yellowed teeth. "I told you, Caldwell," Goals sneered, his chest heaving. "The Pinkertons always get their due. Charlie Siringo himself couldn't have tracked that woman better than I did. Now you're going to bleed out in the mud, and I'm going to go inside and cut that locket off her pretty little neck." Alice braced his boots in the mud. He prepared to charge, knowing full well he wouldn't make it halfway before G put a bullet directly through his heart. He thought of Nancy, huddled in the freezing root cellar. He thought of little Elijah, not even a week old, whose first sounds were the echoes of gunfire. He had failed them. The mountain had finally won. He locked his dark eyes onto G, refusing to die on his knees. Suddenly, a sound like a cannon blast shattered the valley. Boom! The sound was so deafening it physically reverberated in Alice's chest. A cloud of thick, accurate white gun smoke billowed out from the porch. Josiah Gould didn't even have time to scream. The massive .05-90 caliber slug from the Sharp's buffalo rifle caught him dead in the center of his right shoulder. The sheer kinetic energy of the round spun the Pinkerton agent like a top, nearly severing his arm from the socket. His revolver flew into the brush. Gold collapsed face first into the mud, a high-pitched, reedy wail finally tearing from his throat as shock gave way to agonizing pain. Silence slammed back down onto the clearing, heavy and absolute, broken only by the dripping of melting snow and Gall's pathetic whimpering. Alice slowly turned his head, fighting the dizzying pain in his ribs. Standing in the doorway, the heavy oak door kicked wide open, was Nancy. She was barefoot, her toes curled against the freezing blood-stained floorboards. She wore nothing but a thin white cotton nightgown draped under Alice's oversized canvas coat. Her auburn hair hung in wild, sweaty tangles around her pale face. In her hands she held the massive 12-LB Sharp's rifle. Smoke was still curling lazily from the thick octagonal barrel. The brutal recoil of the weapon had physically knocked her backward. Her shoulder was already blooming into a massive dark purple bruise, and she was leaning heavily against the doorframe to stay upright. But her storm-gray eyes were locked on Gull's writhing form in the mud, and they held absolutely no mercy. Out here, grace won't stop a bullet. Nancy, his own words, echoed in his mind. She had listened. The woman who had birthed a child mere days ago had climbed out of the dark, hauled a weapon meant for dropping 2-ton beasts to her shoulder, and pulled the trigger without a flinch. Alice ignored the burning in his side. He pushed himself off the woodpile and leant heavily toward Galt. He kicked the fallen Pinkerton's gun out of reach, then knelt in the mud, pressing his heavy knee onto the agent's chest to keep him pinned. "The Dalton gang!" gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips, his eyes rolling in terror. "Bob Dalton, he knows he won't stop hunting her. The Union Pacific money." Nancy stepped off the porch. She didn't flinch as her bare feet sank into the freezing mud and slush. She walked with a terrifying absolute calm right up to where Alice held Go down. She stared down at the bleeding man. Then her hands moved to her throat. With a sharp, decisive yank, she snapped the tarnished silver chain of the locket she had protected for so long. She held the cheap piece of jewelry in her palm. With trembling, soot-stained fingers, she pried the stiff clasp open. Inside, tucked perfectly behind a miniature, faded tint-type portrait of her mother, was a tiny, tightly folded square of translucent vellum paper. Nancy pulled it out. Even from where he knelt, Alice could see the microscopic, densely packed numbers written on it, bank routing codes, ledger totals, and map coordinates. Thomas Jenkins's insurance policy, $50,000 in stolen Union Pacific gold, sitting right there in her palm. Nancy looked at it, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the paper that had killed her husband, ruined her life, and brought violence to the only sanctuary she had ever known. "You want it so badly," she whispered, her voice rough. She turned and walked back toward the porch steps. She didn't go inside. Instead, she walked to the corner railing where Alice kept a small tin bucket of kerosene for the cabin lanterns. She dropped the piece of vellum directly onto the wooden porch boards, kicked the bucket over, splashing kerosene across the paper, and struck a sulfur match against her thumbnail. "No, wait!" Gold screamed weakly, struggling against Alice's knee. "That's $50,000. That's a fortune." Nancy dropped the match. The kerosene ignited with a soft whump. The vellum paper flashed into bright blue and orange flame, curling tightly, blackening and turning into useless, fragile ash in a matter of seconds. The wind caught the ashes, scattering them into the mountain breeze. "Thomas Jenkins is dead," Nancy said, a voice ringing out loud and clear over the mountainside, carrying the weight of a judge passing a final sentence. "And his blood money burned with him. You tell the Pinkertons, you tell the Daltons, you tell anyone who comes looking that there is nothing left on Travers Peak but a widow who knows how to shoot." G stared at the scorch mark on the porch, his spirit breaking completely as the shock of his ruined shoulder finally took him and he passed out in the mud. Nancy stood there for a moment, watching the smoke drift away. Then the adrenaline that had fueled her finally evaporated. The heavy buffalo rifle slipped from her bruised fingers, clattering loudly onto the porch boards. Her legs buckled beneath her, but she didn't hit the floor. Alice was there. He caught her in his massive arms, lifting her effortlessly from the freezing mud, ignoring the searing pain in his own ribs. He pulled her tight against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck, smelling the sharp tang of cordite mixed with the sweet, clean scent of her skin. He was shaking. The hardened, solitary mountain man was trembling like a leaf. "You're safe," Alice murmured, his voice thick, hot tears finally breaking free and mixing with the mud and soot on his face. "You're both safe. I swear it before God, Nancy. I've got you." Nancy clung to his heavy wool shirt, her fingers burying into the fabric. She pressed her ear against his chest, listening to the frantic, strong, steady beat of his heart beneath the canvas coat. The nightmare was over. The past was literally ashes. "We need to go back inside, Alice," she whispered, her voice faint but laced with a small, exhausted smile. "It's cold out here, and Elijah is going to be waking up hungry." Alice nodded, tightening his grip on her. He carried her back into the warmth of the cabin, kicking the heavy oak door shut against the world with his boot. The spring had come to the bitter roots, bringing the wolves to his door, but they had found a lioness waiting for them instead. And as Alice looked at the woman in his arms, he knew his solitary life was over, forever. And for the first time in a decade, he was truly, finally home. The legend of Alice and Nancy Caldwell didn't end with the blood spilled in the spring mud. It began there. The Pinkertons eventually found the frozen bodies of G and his men at the bottom of a ravine, assuming the treacherous mountain had claimed them, just as it claimed so many foolish enough to challenge it. Trapper's Peak kept its secrets. Over the years, the solitary cabin expanded into a sprawling homestead. Alice, the hardened mountain man, learned that true strength wasn't found in isolation, but in the fierce, unyielding grace of a woman who refused to break. Nancy, who arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and a shadow, built a legacy of warmth and resilience. Together they raised Elijah and 3 more children among the pines, proving that even in the most unforgiving wilderness, love, fiercely defended, can put down the deepest roots.